I have always wondered why the labor migration industry stakeholders do not see this as questioned below. Who would lose if Ugandan migrant workers are given a life cover insurance policy to cover them from the threats exposed to them, and they die from abroad miserably and either be buried there or their bodies being repatriated home in panic and buried like dogs without any compensation? Who would lose if the living Ugandan migrant workers abroad live associated in a one unilateral social welfare administration and do not have to suffer issues of divisions in mind to collective bargaining pertaining their welfare when they have got to face off almost the same environment repeatedly in a bid to wonder for their families? Who would lose if all Ugandan migrant workers would be capable of receiving timely and better medical treatment under a common medical insurance policy in the destination countries, and that they do not have to die calling for better treatment from their parents, government, bloggers, civil society organizations, witch doctors, and anyone on media other than Panadol always given to them at their employer's mercy? Who would lose if all Ugandan migrant workers have got someone to talk to physically on ground while in distress at work overseas from time to time, with call centers facilitated and available in each city where they are deployed, than a mere mobile application and embassy link with limitations and possibilities of workers' funds being confiscated, and they do not have to first call home for any ministers and bloggers for support and guidance in their labor disputes? Who would lose if all the dying Ugandan migrant workers return home and receive a decent burial with a death benefit of at least not less than 20 million per family through their social welfare arrangements, and that their families and children not to be left barehanded, and yet some have to foot their repatriation bills? Who would lose if all Ugandan migrant workers had access to a complete pre-medical assessment by government prior to their exit, and that they do not have to first reach in destination countries and anyone claims that their organs have been lost? Who would lose if there is separation of power in the labor externalization industry among stakeholders, and that every stakeholder does not have to compromise the rights of the other in order to assert their relevance and position? Who would lose if recruitment processes are eased and made faster without bureaucracy to enable recruitment agencies and migrant workers not fall prone into human trafficking activities that may end up frustrating business and jeopardizing lives of migrant workers? Who would lose if all Ugandan exiting migrant workers are well-oriented and openly informed about the real-life situation to be encountered at work abroad before they get there and start regretting why they made such a choice to leave their country untold of the truth after having been abandoned, especially if labor export business cannot be avoided and they cannot avoid going due to the sagging levels of unemployment in the country? Who would lose if the Migrant Workers Administration has its own independent database of all its members to help administration to eliminate possible trafficking elements, and in comparison, in case of any arising claims over missing or suffering migrant workers abroad? Who would lose if all Ugandan migrant workers get to be trained by their fellow senior experienced migrant workers who have previously been exposed through the same experiences away from the theory graduate teachers who seem to be lacking the know-how of the real-life experience happening at work overseas? Who would lose if every Ugandan migrant worker gets a well-paying job and they do not have to beg for unequal pay even when they work more than their fellows from other countries. Who would lose? If every migrant worker returning in a sick state, be it mental or physical trauma, he or she be entitled to a compensation package from their social welfare arrangement to enable them get treatment and support while spending their remaining life home without suffering with medical bills. Who would lose? If all returning mentally sick migrant workers abroad are provided with special homes or rehabs that can give them psychosocial support on return home during their days of recovery. Who would lose? If each Ugandan migrant worker aspiring to leave the country would have access to cheap, efficient, timely safe labor clearance processes with all their records captured, including their destinations, and one doesn't have to first reach abroad to begin looking for details, especially in times of distress. Who would lose? If every migrant worker leaving Uganda would not have to worry about tortures and all sorts of possible subjections to slavery abroad. If at all government had signed different labor bilateral arrangements with different countries binding to the international norms of protection of migrant workers. Who would lose? If every external labor recruitment company had a right to defend their business interests without having them be compelled by the administrator to compromise on defending rights of workers they have already exported with a profit, through each of them acquiring a monitoring desk for these workers and carry all the liabilities of the employer, and at the same time acting in the position of workers. Who would lose? If all migrant workers had possible ways to access a lawyer or justice in the labor courts of destination countries, if at all their workers' administration is empowered and protected by the embassy in helping to guide and counsel their fellow workers in times of distress, as well as collective bargaining in these destination countries. Who would lose? If all recruitment agencies deploying Ugandan migrant workers for work through safe labor means do not have to worry much or a lot about these Ugandans deployed overseas if government has functional embassies with full jurisdiction to spearhead the role of monitoring and follow-up without having to first query of who is asking for help, and workers having to be subjected to go through filling embassy elongated forms and links which sometimes do not serve the exact purpose expected, and yet so hard and stressful for the expected victims who are majority illiterates and expected to fill them in a language that is hard for them to speak or understand. Who would lose? If all of us instead insisted on protecting our labor industry so that it can also look after us. To what extent would this effort at a country-to-country affluence stimulate business? How many policies and how many stakeholders would need, and how would all that impact business if we aimed at country affluence? How much would this impact business positively? Why then do we only have bad businessmen and administrators who do not have efficient spectacles that can see these business opportunities that are implied if we aimed at country affluence? Therefore, in my opinion, parasitism is the only obstacle to the country affluence, prosperity, and peace. Kayonde Abdallah.